Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to something I've wanted to do for bloody ages now. Dead by Daylight prides itself on taking inspiration from and showing love to the history of horror cinema, which, along with the steady stream of characters directly ported from those movies, puts our silly little looping game in a fairly unique position. We have a community full of folks whose relationship with horror movies is very different. Some, like me, are dedicated horror fanatics, drawn to the game by its characters, themes, or visual design. The come for the horror, stay for the game types. But others consume DBD entirely as a game. Players who've racked up thousands of hours who might never have seen a horror film in their lives. This video intends to marry the two. This match made in heaven like DS and Unbreakable, Wraith and Sloppy Butcher, or Leon players in a fresh pack of tasty Crayola. So today we'll be going through all the original killers and recommending to their mains some horror movies that I think fit the character in question well. Sometimes I'm basing my picks on the character's lore and themes. Sometimes it's off the character's aesthetic or time period. Sometimes it's just off vibes. And I'll only be covering original killers here with one notable exception, because, well, it should be pretty obvious. Yes, if you play Chucky, you'll probably like the Child's Play movies, if you don't already, but you also shouldn't need a YouTube video to tell you that. So let's get started with The Trapper. If you like The Trapper, you should watch My Bloody Valentine, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Ev McMillan is in many ways our archetypical 80s slasher. A big scary guy in an imposing mask, cutting people up with a cleaver. And the obvious comparison here is horror's greatest mama's boy, Jason Voorhees. So Friday the 13th is the obvious choice. But I think there are better options. And not just because I think Trapper isn't even the best Jason analogue in the cast. Trapper has a distinctly industrial look and setting in his lore, so comparing him to Jason, who's strictly a wilderness slasher, kind of misses the point of Jason for me. A better point for comparison here is the prevalence of small town slashers from the 70s through to the 90s. Trapper might look like Jason, but he belongs more in works like My Bloody Valentine, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Bloody Valentine is hands down the closest to Trapper, with the whole industrial mining town being a dead ringer for the Macmillan mining empire, and Trapper even having multiple miner-inspired skins. But The Town That Dreaded Sundown is a 1974 film that shows how the presence of an anonymous out-of-context killer can warp a whole town's sense of security, while I Know What You Did Last Summer is a great time capsule of mid-90s horror cinema that evokes the imagery of classic slashers like Freddy and Jason, while still doing something that was, at least for the time, fairly new and refreshing. A modern classic slasher movie for Dead by Daylight's modern classic slasher killer, who set the bar for the later killers to come. If you like Wraith, watch Predator and Lake Mungo. Okay, so kinda like Trapper and Jason, the superficial connections between Wraith and Predator are pretty hard to ignore. An invisible, growling hunter who uses the spine of his victim with a perk literally named Predator, like, come on. But aside from these illusions, Filippo Jomo is kind of nothing like a predator at all. He's a timid man who abhors mindless killing and was traumatized by the revelation that his job at the car crusher was hurting people. So I decided to look instead at ghost stories that use ghosts, wraiths if you will, to explore a particular theme or idea that resonates with Philip's character. More than any other, Lake Mungo really stood out to me as an exploration both of a tight-knit family marred by an inexplicable tragedy that can never be repaired, which is pretty much the story of Philip's childhood, and how grief at the loss of your family manifests in desperation and struggle to keep what's left of them alive, even to the cost of those still living around you. Lake Mungo is a genuinely grim and heartbreaking movie, and even if you don't think it clicks with Philip's story, I still recommend you watch it, because I absolutely adore it and there's a good chance you will too. If you like the Hillbilly, you should watch The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, and Wrong Turn. And thus concludes the holy trinity of completely fucking obvious recommendations with the Hillbilly. Because if you somehow weren't aware that the Hillbilly was inspired by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, then, well, yeah, he was. The southern rural setting with the guttural screaming and the heavy theming of meat and slaughtered animals and the obvious, chainsaw. There's a lot to work with. But the Sawyer family are much crueler and more pointlessly vicious than our boy Max here. So if you're looking more towards the physical deformities that Billy has, then maybe The Hills Have Eyes might be up your alley. The original or the reboot, either works. The original version of Pluto, played by Michael Berryman, is the closest horror movie villain I can think of to Billy. He's a vicious hunter and killer with physical disabilities, but is still smarter than many give him credit for, and despite his brutality, he's still given more humanizing moments than rest of Papa Jupiter's family. Wrong Turn's another entry in the deformed wilderness hillbilly hunter subgenre that I honestly don't rate very highly, but I feel wrong not at least recommending it if we're bringing up visual inspirations for the hillbilly, and the general vibes around his map and character design. If you like The Nurse, you should watch The Cure for Wellness, Jacob's Ladder, and Possum. After the conventional archetypes of the original three killers, the nurse stands out as a bit of an oddity. Her whole thing is that she worked at a mental asylum for 20 years, but her power set and visual design don't really reflect that, with the bone saw and the uniform in general seeming to fit more of a physician than a mental healthcare worker. So when I was browsing around, I decided to look at movies that use imagery of physical health to convey a character's degrading mental health. And this led me naturally to Jacob's Ladder, what I consider the definitive psychological horror movie. It uses body horror and psychedelia-style trips into Jacob's mindscape to reflect everything he's been through in Vietnam and the secret of his final fate, which I will not spoil because you should totally watch it. Other films I love that do things like this include The Cure for Wellness, which is an absolute visual marvel of creepiness that fits the Crotus Pren aesthetic better than any film I've ever seen, and Possum, in which the abuse suffered by the miserable protagonist Philip is reminiscent of the abuse Sally Smithson herself had to endure before she snapped and Crotus Pren fell. Both really fun films with very distinct visual styles to convey the horror, so do go take a look. If you like The Huntress, you should watch Friday the 13th Remake and In a Violent Nature. Much like Trapper, Huntress is another white mask conventional style slasher, and once again Jason Voorhees comes to mind. At least narratively, Huntress is a lot more like Jason than Trapper is. He's effectively a campfire story, a lone wanderer in the woods, influenced by her mother who views anyone who strays into her territory to be worthy prey for the hunt. Just watch the Friday the 13th remake and you'll really get what I mean, I think. Jason in that film is portrayed as a territorial and surprisingly intelligent hunter, which reminds me a lot of The Huntress. Another movie that I think expertly conveys the patient, relentless nature of the Huntress is a new one, actually, In a Violent Nature, which released only in May this year. In a Violent Nature tells the story of a fairly conventional slasher movie from the point of view of the slasher, and it very much puts you in the shoes of a methodical stalker hunting for prey in the woods. Also, its leading man Johnny is a dab hand with an axe, so what's not to love? If you like The Hag, you should watch The Descent, The Ruins, and The Blair Witch Project. Hag is probably one of the hardest killers to come up with for this list because, honestly, a lot about her character doesn't often translate into good movies. Her backstory has implications of voodoo worship, given that she's a member of a tight-knit black community in the bayous of Louisiana. But historically, voodoo has been demonized and misrepresented time and time again in Hollywood, especially in horror cinema. So representing a voodoo-related horror movie would feel in bad taste. Much of the twisted, mutilated cannibal film genre has already been done in this list with the Hillbilly. I think the films that best fit Hag's intended vibe are the softcore supernatural environmental horror, the kind of horror where the biggest threat isn't necessarily a creature or a person inherently, but a location, and what it does to the people who live there. The Hag is a product of her environment, and the physical and mental trauma that Lisa Sherwood experienced. The bayou changed her forever into something unmistakably different from a human being. The Blair Witch Project is a great example of that in cinema. Despite the Blair Witch being ostensibly the film's big threat, it's the dizzying trickery of the forest itself that provides the constant threat and the tension for our characters. The Descent and The Ruins are similarly desperate and gritty films that weaponize the location against the characters and warp the life there into horrifying parodies of normal organisms. The Descent's ghoul-like crawlers are almost secondary to the claustrophobic role that caves themselves play in generating the horror by creating the cramped, dark conditions that allowed the crawlers to evolve in the first place. Plus, Hag kinda looks like one if you rolled her in mud. The Ruins comes at this from a different angle. The carnivorous plants are the main threat in that film, but not only are they part and parcel of the setting weaponized against our characters, it's clear from the start that you also can't really beat them. The only thing the characters can do is figure out a way to maybe escape the pyramid they're trapped on, to escape the location. These films are all absolute certified bangers, which makes it kind of weird to me to recommend them when Hag's lore is so comprehensively shit. But I guess that just goes to show that there was maybe a genuinely interesting story waiting to be told that unfortunately behaviour fumbled. If you like The Doctor, you should watch Excision, Crimes of the Future, and Tusk. Much like The Nurse, The Doctor leverages the common phenomenon of medical horror. As such, much of what applies to The Nurse applies to him too, especially The Cure for Wellness. but the Doctor's particular brand of horror is more visceral and surgical than the nurse's. He has done countless ethical surgeries and procedures over the years, so the films to recommend for him should have as much fun with weird, horrifying surgery as he does. Excision is the perfect pick here. It's all about the twisted psychological fascinations of its lead, Pauline, and it mirrors Carter's own stories of experimenting on his parents and animals even at a young age. The 2022 version of Cronenberg's Crimes of the Future had similar explorations with surgery, but done very differently. It gives a vision of what the future might be like if someone obsessed with removing the humanity from humanity, like the Doctor, actually got his way. And for a film that handles surgical horror and psychological conditioning in a more fun way, there's always Kevin Smith's Tusk. The Doctor clearly has fun with what he does, certainly too much fun. And Tusk invites you to share in the fun of weird surgery with a heavy coating of black comedy. Tusk might just be the worst film I recommend in this video, but I can't think of a film that better expresses the Doctor's balance of grisly and gleeful. It's not Kino, but it could be worse. I could have mentioned The Human Centipede. If you like The Clown, you should watch Terrifier and House of a Thousand Corpses, or really any film by Rob Zombie. Speaking of horror and comedy, The Clown occupies a fairly unique position in Dead by Daylight's roster, where his actions and inspirations come from very serious places, but are treated in a somewhat comedic fashion through the absurdity and questionable competence of the killer himself. I can't think of any film that expresses this better than Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses, which takes a grungy, grimy setting and populates it with wacky and wild characters who sell the horrors to come by just being fun to watch interacting with each other, even if they are horrifying people. It's not a horror comedy, but it's still a lot of fun. Special mention goes to Captain Spaulding, played by the late great Sid Haig, who aside from the real John Wayne Gacy is probably the biggest inspiration behind DVD's Clown. Honestly, if you like Clown's grimy, dark comedy, Americana vibes, you can just watch Rob Zombie's entire filmography and you'll probably find what you're looking for. But Sid Haig's time as Spaulding in the Firefly trilogy, and especially House of a Thousand Corpses, is a point of exceptional note. And we can't talk about egregiously violent killer clowns without talking about Terrifier, and its painted psychopath Art the Clown. The Terrifier movies are not for everyone, but if you like a comically evil sadist in a clown costume, then it kind of goes without saying that here's somewhere you might want to look. It's important to remember that in both Spaulding and Art's cases, they don't really have a sort of killer clown gimmick per se. They're just psychopathic killers who use the clown get-up as a way to express their comic absurdity and share it with the viewer, something which DBD's Clown does as well. If you like the spirit, you should watch The Grudge, Hereditary, Insidious, and Oculus. Spirit's story can be loosely summed up as a generational trauma simulator rooted heavily in its Japanese setting, and there's plenty of stories with these themes that you can look to if you want more of that. J-horror is a widely beloved subgenre of horror for a reason, and Spirit was very directly and unsubtly inspired by The Grudge and to a lesser degree The Ring. I don't want to go too much into The Grudge's plot details because I think it's a film you've got to watch for yourself, but seriously, just go watch The Grudge, if you've not already seen it. But even outside of Japan, generational trauma explored as a monster or haunting has been practically cliché in horror since Hereditary and Insidious rocked the box office. And I'd recommend taking a look at both movies even though they go at the generational trauma thing from more of the parent's point of view than the child's, like Spirit does. If you'd rather take a look at generational trauma and supernatural horror from the point of view of the child experiencing it, Oculus presents a good alternative that uses a cursed mirror full of trippy psychological effects to, well, mirror the damage the children experienced again when they reach adulthood and try to confront the past. These films are all great choices for Spirit enjoyers and pretty essential viewing for horror fans in general. If you like The Legion, you should watch Scream, The Strangers, and The Purge. The Legion is probably Dead by Daylight's most mundane killer in terms of their premise. They're just teenage dirtbags, baby, who run around and stab you with their knives. There's not really much there. But that mundanity means there's probably a deeper well of horror movies to draw from than most of DBD's killer roster. When you think of a group of white-masked murderous teenagers working together, the first one you're thinking of is probably Scream. But I hesitate to put Scream on the recommendations list for a specific killer, because I honestly think everyone can and should watch Scream, whether you're a Legion enthusiast or not. Also, Ghostface is next on my list. But there are still tons of films that exploit the mundanity of anonymous masked killers for effective horror, and my personal picks here are The Strangers and the first Purge movie. The first Purge, that is. Not the first Purge, which is actually the fourth Purge. The actual first Purge. The two movies are very different, with The Strangers playing its cards close to its chest and leaving the mystery of who the attackers are and why they're attacking hanging over the story for as long as possible to veil the mindless petty sadism of the home invaders in an air of genuine terror, while The Purge goes the other way, and is so unsubtle with its premise and themes that it takes a shot at wide-arcing social commentary that only becomes more clear as the sequels continue. Regardless, the image of a mundane group of people in masks playing being powerful murderers and coming surprisingly close to the real deal is one that will endure in horror for years to come, and it makes the Legion, for all their simplicity, surprisingly timeless. If you like Ghostface, you should watch Scream, duh, Maniac, The House That Jack Built, and the Poughkeepsie tapes. Ghostface is the only licensed killer I'm putting on this list because despite the mask being licensed, Danny Johnson is a behaviour original creation, and his presentation as a Ghostface killer is very different from the Ghostfaces of Scream. While, yes, Scream is a great place to start for any of DBD's Ghostface fans, Danny takes himself far more seriously and is far more successful as a serial killer than any of Scream's Ghostfaces. This means that there's a whole different set of movies to look at if you want something adjacent to DBD's version of Ghostface. The psychology of a serial killer type films that centre themselves on profiling the film's chosen slasher subject. Maniac and The House That Jack Built are two of my favourite examples of this. Maniac takes a tragic and thoughtful angle to the brutality of its focal character without trying to justify him, while The House That Jack Built was a dark comedy from the mind of Lars von Trier that exposes the delusions of grandiosity common to your average sociopath. But I'd be remiss not to mention one of my favourite horror films of all time, the found-footage mockumentary The Poughkeepsie Tapes. Similar to Lake Mungo, Poughkeepsie uses the fake documentary to tell a tale that kind of prophesies the modern true crime craze. But unlike Mungo, Poughkeepsie uses the formula to tell the story of a sadistic serial killer and the sheer impossible terror he inflicts on those in his way. The film is unremittingly bleak, using camera footage from the killer's own point of view to showcase the depths of the malice behind the mask, and it's honestly very similar to Danny Johnson's habit of reporting on his own crimes as the Ghostface of Roseville. I highly encourage watching it, just, not after eating. If you like The Plague, you should watch The Mummy, Cabin Fever, Saint Maud, and 2013's remake of Evil Dead. Plague. Adiris marked the start of Dead by Daylight's turn towards historical settings for their killers, and as a result, the pop culture inspirations behind new killers started to become less obvious. DBD's originals were becoming more, original. But that doesn't mean there's not still stuff to find here. Adiris is the closest Dead by Daylight has to a mummy character, an ancient priestess who resembles a mouldering cadaver that inflicts her victims with a terrible, I want to say curse, but it's a bit ickier than a curse. Beyond the mummy inspirations, Adiris fans might do well to look at Cabin Fever, which is one of the rare times a contagion-based horror movie doesn't just turn into a zombie flick. Eli Roth may be a bit of a weirdo, and he did make Borderlands, but that film never fails to make my skin crawl. Can't beat a bit of Cabin Fever. Adiris' story also approaches the damaging power of one's faith and what happens when strife tests your faith and ability to help others. So Saint Maud immediately jumped to mind. It's a painful and beautiful story of a woman struggling with her faith and what she believes is her duty to save the soul of her charge. Before I move on, I also want to give a shout out to 2013's Evil Dead remake, because of the way it treats the Necronomicon and how it fits in with the Adiris' religious fanaticism. The Necronomicon's role is more like a ritual object that brings our world closer to hell, heightened in this film by the victims of the Deadites treated as blood sacrifices to bring about some sort of demonic apocalypse, symbolised by the blood rain, and our characters are stuck unwillingly in the middle of what's effectively a doomsday ritual. Adiris is forced into a similar situation. Her practices of human sacrifice in Babylon as a priestess put her on track for damnation long before the sickness claimed the city, and her actions as High Priestess bring a similar near-biblical apocalypse to her and her followers. If you like the Oni, you should watch Oni Baba and the original Speak No Evil. Similar to Plague, Oni's historical setting choice makes picking movies here quite challenging, but I think I found a couple. Kazan's setting in the Meiji Restoration is pretty unique, and not one you typically see explored in movies, especially not in horror films. The closest I've found and watched is the 1964 Japanese film Oni Baba, which follows two women in medieval Japan who kill wandering soldiers and steal their armour before a neighbour returning from war and a stranger in a mysterious Hanya mask come between them. I don't know much about Japanese horror beyond contemporary stuff, so I might be missing something important, but it's the best I can do for that vibe and historical period. But if it's Kazan's relationship with his family that interests you, how his son becomes a tool for his idea of what a family looks like and how he reacts violently, I can highly recommend 2022's Dutch film Speak No Evil. It's getting an American remake that comes out next month, you've probably seen the trailers for it, but frankly the original is just too good to miss out on. And a lot of it's in English, so there really is no excuse not to take a look. Kazan's life as an aggressive, domineering patriarch wasn't just limited to his crusade across Japan. It was a life he lived every day, and his family and those around him paid the price for his murderous rages. Speak No Evil showcases what a depraved and violent monster like Kazan could be to those around him, even off the battlefield. The brutal cruelty and tongue trauma of Speak No Evil reminded me of the implications present in Kazan's story and tome, and the fact that around him a great many normal people, including his own family, had to basically let him do what he wanted because of his might, prestige and the threat of retaliation. Speak No Evil is not a film that necessarily parallels Kazan or his life, but when I see the main antagonist Patrick and the degree of boisterous cruelty he subjects his victims to because he's given the benefit of the doubt, I can't help but see a little of the Oni Yamaoka in him. If you like the Deathslinger, you should watch Wolf Creek and Bone Tomahawk, and read the book Blood Meridian. Okay, this is going to be the last time pulling off the historical horror excuse, I promise, but just like Plague and Oni, Deathslinger was not the easiest candidate to find movies for simply because the overlap between westerns and horror is not particularly huge, at least in cinema. Bone Tomahawk is the best I've got for you here if you want a properly grisly horror western. It really does have everything. But it is bloody grisly, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. Just watch it and you'll realise why I'm recommending it. It's cruel and brutal and spectacular, so take a look. Wolf Creek is another example of a almost perfect horror western in a gorgeously dead, arid setting with a legitimately scary hunter as the main antagonist, except with one slight hiccup. It's not set in the Wild West, but instead the Australian outback. Seriously, if you watch the movie with it in mind, you'll realise in terms of tone that this movie could easily have been a western if it wasn't like the most Australian film ever made. Truth be told, if you really want a horror western story that fits with the desperate, desolate vibe of Slinger's lore and character, read the 1985 novel Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. The desolate, hopeless terror of the frontier, haunted by the impossibly domineering figure of Judge Holden, paints a grim picture of the Wild West that aligns with behaviour's take on the setting and story of the Deathslinger, so I'd really suggest you take a look. If you like The Blight, you should watch Malignant, Perfume, Story of a Murderer, and Tetsuo, the Iron Man. Right, this is where I get to have a bit of a breather, because despite Blight being yet another historical horror, Victorian Europe is a far better represented setting for horror stories than feudal Japan, ancient Babylonia, or the Wild West. And it helps that Blight's story is explicitly based on the tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You might reasonably think that I'd recommend watching an adaptation of that story then, but the issue is that basically every direct adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde's story is kind of bad. And the twist in the original novel that makes the novel fun to read is common knowledge by now, so reading the book doesn't give quite the same effect that it really should. However, there are plenty of horror films inspired by Jekyll and Hyde that I can thoroughly recommend, that explore the relationship between a timid and peaceful main personality and a cruel or merciless alter ego. Malignant is one of my favourite movies of all time, and it handles this duality in a fun and tense way, wearing the disguise of a supernatural horror movie while sharing much of the bizarre medical horror that defines The Blight. But more than a battle between alter egos, The Blight story is about the fall of a man to his obsession, his bottomless desire for perfection consuming everything he is until he warps into something that he never wanted to be. Perfume, Story of a Murderer is an amazing showcase of a character like this in a setting that's very similar to Blight's too. It's set in 18th century France and follows the story of a French perfume maker who tries to distill the perfect scent to make up for the fact that he's the only person in the world to truly smell of nothing. He eventually attains his goal, but at the cost of losing what defined him and is ultimately going through a severe existential crisis that mirrors the Blight's own, as his research into the blighted serum costs him his identity and sense of self. My personal pick for the blightiest movie ever is another Japanese film, Tetsuo the Iron Man. Tetsuo follows an ordinary man with a deep fascination for and fetish for metal, who slowly transforms into a kind of cyborg. He has dreams of metal and mechanisms, and it starts to filter into every aspect of his life and relationships until it consumes him completely. We end up with a cyberpunk biomechanical monster very reminiscent of the Blight's transformation into a plant-like creature as a result of his spiralling obsession that turns him more monster than man. If you like the twins, you should watch Gretel and Hansel, The Witch, and Basket Case. Similar to Blight, twins have a rich and clear inspiration in terms of their tone from Victorian literature. I've referred to them as Victor Hugo core before, because while their status as conjoined twins is something that you don't see every day, the tone of their story and the setting is reflective of the bleak and miserable novel Les Miserables. Although I wouldn't go so far as to recommend the movie unless you really like Russell Crowe pretending to sing by shouting very loudly.
Get me asunder! No.
If you want a horror movie starring conjoined twins who separate like Charlotte and Victor do, then Basket Case is indispensable. I don't particularly like the movie itself, but it's possible to talk about the twins without at least acknowledging its existence. The twins' story also took inspiration from many bleak period horror movies that take a more fantastical or even fairy tale approach to the time period, as opposed to purely historical. Robert Eggers' The Witch is a great example of a film like this. It treats mysticism as a fact of life, and uses it to illustrate our main character's temptation by the devil, similar to how the twin story uses the Black Veil's mystical experimentation to test Charlotte's bond with Victor and set up their future service as killers, without making it a fantasy story about mysticism. Gretel and Hansel explore similar ideas through a dark fairy tale lens. Oz Perkins' Gretel has to find her own way to survive in a world that isn't willing to accommodate a girl like her, while also protecting her vulnerable younger brother. It's a wonderful mirror to Charlotte's own story that even came out the same year that Twins released, and it's a gorgeous film, so do go take a look. If you like Trickster, you should watch The Neon Demon, American Psycho, and Spree. Trickster regularly gets allegations from DVD players that he's not a horror character. More at home on the cover of GQ than Fangoria. And while those folks have died down since his release, they're definitely still present. But I could not disagree more. Horror can be glamorous and gaudy and showbizy, and to approach certain themes or explore certain ideas, it kinda has to be. Nicholas Winding Refn's The Neon Demon is the perfect showcase of this. It's set in the modelling industry and plays up the glamour and style inherent to high fashion, which makes the juxtaposition to gore and violence all the more jarring as it says what it wants to about the cutthroat world where aesthetics trump morality. Comparing Ji-woon to American Psycho's Patrick Bateman also showcases how pathetic Ji-woon truly is. Much like Ji-woon, Batman kills... Much like... I call him fucking Batman. Much like Ji-woon, Bateman kills for the most mundane and egotistical reasons, besotted with the fantasy that he's special or better than everyone around him, despite the man himself being nothing more than an empty shell in a nice suit. Finally, Spree, starring the inimitable Joe Keery, takes Ji-woon's insatiable desire for the spotlight that drove his ascent into stardom and applies it to a genuinely talentless young man trying to get online fame through his murders. Spree is stylish and fun, takes advantage of modern innovations to tell a story that we haven't really been able to see before historically, so while it's not my favourite film, I definitely think you should at least take a look at it. If you like the artist, you should watch Baptism of Blood and Longlegs. Yeah, in case you need to know, I'm spoiling Longlegs in this one. Massive fucking spoilers for Longlegs. So, skip ahead to Dredge if you don't want to hear them. So, Carmina Mora. Artist lore is definitely a strange one. She's from Chile, not a setting that gets a lot of love in mainstream cinema, and her story has lots of different elements that come together with varying degrees of success. Her story is heavy on politically subversive elements and messaging, and perhaps unsurprisingly there isn't too much material covering the 20th century South American dictatorships, especially in the horror genre. However, the Brazilian film Baptism of Blood that explores the Brazilian dictatorship in the 70s and the brutal torture dissidents experience at the hands of the regime is, in my opinion, essential viewing. Carmina held her beliefs strong and suffered greatly for them, and Baptism of Blood is a superbly shot and acted movie that could desperately use a wider audience. But there's a lot more to our wonderful Miss Mora than just a revolutionary. Her relationship with the entity is defined by the trauma she felt when she was young and how her time making art dealt with that trauma, which is what might make Longlegs an interesting inclusion for this list. Carmina Mora spent her entire life haunted by the entity, the crows following her through her pain and becoming an image that she pioneers in her artwork. But this comes with the trauma of losing her mother and brother, and the eventual realisation that her abusive father is working for the Black Veil and effectively sold her out to the entity. Longlegs' Lee Harker finds a similar revelation. The devil has blessed her with precognition that allows her to be a good FBI agent, but that only came about because of her abusive mother working for Longlegs, who, again, effectively sold her out to the devil, along with so many other young families, to keep Lee alive. Both of them have low-level supernatural power connected to an all-powerful terror that inducted their abusive parents into their service. Longlegs is definitely a lot more than just that, but the similarities are certainly there. If you like the Dredge, you should watch The Babadook, The Empty Man, and The Wicker Man. As behaviour's first killer that was explicitly never a human being, the Dredge is always going to have a very different origin and inspiration than the killers that came before it. Dredge is effectively a tulpa, a creature brought about by the collective fear of it from an entire population, brought up to a fever pitch and condensed into a physical body. The Babadook is another example of such a thing in action. The film leaves it ambiguous whether the Babadook was ever really something that existed before Sam and Amelia's grief started to coalesce it into the creature, even assuming it exists now. A common interpretation is that the shared grief and frustration of the two collectively pooled to make the creature real. And that's pretty much what happened for the birth of the Dredge as well, just on a way bigger scale. The Empty Man also nails this idea of a thought form emerging from emotions and fears, but I won't be covering it too much because you should really just watch it. It's on Disney+, I'm gonna leave it there. But if you find the cult elements of the Dredge's origins to be interesting enough on their own, I can also thoroughly recommend The Wicker Man. It's a real classic, and if you're a horror nut, I'd be surprised if you'd never seen it, but it's the definitive cult horror film, and it really is essential viewing for Dredge fans. If you like the night, you should watch Draug, The Northman, and Army of Darkness. Okay, remember when I said I wasn't going to pull the historical horror excuse again? Yeah, there's not a lot of medieval horror kicking around in the world of cinema, so finding choices for the night was hard, but let's remember here. Night, at least visually, draws a lot of inspiration from dark fantasy and fantasy horror, at least as much as actual medieval Europe. If you want media that reflects the night visually, fantasy novels or games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne and Warhammer are probably your first ports of call more than any kind of horror cinema. If you want to stick to movies though, I've genuinely found better luck finding tireless themes of brutal violence, the rejection of honour and the power of simple bonds in times of strife in Viking films like Draug and The Northman than I have in typical medieval movies. If you want to watch movies where the past is a horrible and violent place and fighting dirty with your boys at your back is the only way you can survive, you could do a lot worse than these two. Although if you want a more fun medieval horror experience, just go watch Army of Darkness, man. It's not got the gothic, cruel barbarism of Knight's lore or character design, but it's just silly fun in the Middle Ages. Look, Knight's about to get a bunch of quality of life improvements and polish, and you guys needed the break. So go celebrate, and go watch a goofy movie where Bruce Campbell fights plastic skeletons for 80 minutes. You guys have really earned it. If you like The Skull Merchant, you should watch Hostel, Would You Rather, The Collector, and Saw. You can't see it, but I'm rubbing my hands together with glee right now. Because one of the many, many reasons I'll go to bat for The Skull Merchant so much is because she hits some of my favourite tropes and themes in horror cinema, and many of my favourite films as well. Much like Wraith, she took a lot of inspiration from Predator, something that some utterly fucking insane people read way too much into. But there's a lot more to Adriana Romai than a wrist blade and a catwalk stride. Skull Merchant fits into a very specific but very well documented horror subgenre of rich people dehumanising their victims and never suffering the consequences because they're so stupidly wealthy they can do whatever they want. And it is a tale as old as time. Hostel, one of my favourite horror movies ever, and Would You Rather both show this off very well. Hostel is beautifully, viscerally cruel, and shows that a perfectly ordinary person on the outside can commit acts of unspeakable brutality without consequences or suspicion by hiding behind anonymity and giant piles of cash, only to get back to their normal lives once the deed is done. And Would You Rather is the chilling portrayal of a genuinely unhinged lunatic empowered by his money to inflict deeply intimate cruelty on helpless guests who have no choice but to take the punishment that he metes out simply because he can. If you want to see what Adriana Romai would be like if you met her in person, this is it. And as for what she's like when she puts on the mask and goes hunting, The Collector hits the mark as well. The collector pits a bunch of competent enough but unaware victims against a complete monster, professional and sadistic in equal measure. The collector is a trained, intelligent and meticulous killer who seemingly has limitless resources and imagination, and does what he does simply because it's in his nature to do so. It's vicious, brutal and a blast to watch. So perfect for the Skull Merchant. The Saw comparison is definitely less obvious, but let me take you on a bit of a walk in logic to show you what I mean, because the key is in the gadgets. John and Adriana both love their contraptions as their tools of torment, and the more I look at the designs, the more I recognise hallmarks of the design that they both have in common. John's devices and general methods are what I would call practicamp. Definitely made with form in mind over function, with tons of rough edges, unpainted metal and loose wiring, just to make sure the damn thing works. But there's still effort put into the aesthetics and theming of the device and how John conducts the games. John maintains the swirls and pig mask and his silly little puppet pal, all the jigsaw regalia that show he's kind of adopted the character more willingly than he lets on, and ensures the games always follow the rules and that the punishment kinda fits the crime to some extent. Adriana follows that same practicamp aesthetic. Her gadgets don't look sleek or polished or, safe, but she'll still put a real skull in her drones, choose her hunts based on her own rules and whims, and use a heavy wrist blade over something more practical just because she's that bitch. It's an aesthetic choice I just adore, and it shouldn't surprise you that I see a little of my favourite film series of all time in what is hands down my favourite DBD character of all time. If you like Singularity, you should watch Hardware, Mad God, and 2001 A Space Odyssey. Now we get to Singularity, who's more or less a mishmash of sci-fi tropes shaken together in a game of Boggle and poured over the killer like sprinkles. In my original video on Singularity, I pointed out the similarities to Am, the evil machine overlord in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and I do stand by that. But there's plenty of Hux in Hollywood's history too. Hardware is a 1990 cult classic British sci-fi film that features probably the closest thing I've ever seen to Hux visually in a sci-fi horror robot. It's a big lumpen mechanical monster that looks like it's made half out of scraps, and while the film is old and campy and very low budget, if you like Hux enough that probably won't stand in your way from enjoying the movie. If we're looking outside the horror genre, 2001 A Space Odyssey is also a very clear point of reference. Hal and Hux are really cut from the same cloth, and if you've seen the movie, you'll know. And if you haven't, well, I'd recommend fixing that ASAP. But hands down, my favourite recommendation for Singularity is Phil Tippett's stop-motion epic Mad God. Because while it's not really space-age sci-fi in the way Singularity's story is, I just don't care. The world Tippett paints is a delicious industrial hellhole, one where Hux's strange biomechanical design feels right at home. It's a world of oozing flesh and exposed cabling, of a monstrous industrial empire worked by countless identical clones who do not seem to understand the scale of the horrors each of them are just a small part of. Everyone should watch Phil Tippett's Mad God. Everyone. And last but not least, if you like the unknown, you should watch Pontypool, Smile, and Sinister. And that leaves us with one. What is that? It's the unknown. The unknown's particular brand of horror is the kind of thing you perhaps associate more with the early days of the internet, with creepypastas and what have you over traditional horror cinema. But there's still plenty of places to look if you want unknown adjacent storytelling on the big screen. Scott Derrickson's work of genius, Sinister, nails two key elements of the unknown: the dedication to old school found footage filming styles like the kind used in the chapter promos, and the presence of a supernatural horror that only becomes more dangerous the more you seek to understand it. The way that Spooky Face over here winds up getting you is kicked off by you finding the Super 8 tapes showing the death of his prior victims, and as his new playthings learn more about the way he operates and the history of what came before, their actions will inevitably walk them even further into his clutches until they're finally killed and the cycle begins again. Pontypool is another case of an info hazard at work in horror cinema, this time carried through the English language. It's a super unique take on a zombie apocalypse film that I really think needs to be seen to be believed. A very fun take on an info hazard with a sequel I'm still really hoping gets made. And speaking of sequels, we're going to wrap this video up with a brand new movie that's getting a sequel very soon in cinemas. Smile. The more you watch this film, the more you realise that it and the unknown are very much cut from the same cloth. The smile curse is carried from person to person by a string of deaths. Not dissimilar to how stories about the unknown killing or staking people allow its myth to spread and thus strengthen the creature. Much of Smile's horror is built around hallucinations and the uncanny valley effect, as the faces of normal people are distorted and twisted into malicious grins, a lot like the unknown's cheeky little smile. The constant hallucinations of its presence and its habit of taking on the forms and voices of its victims to lure people in or fit in with the myths built around it. All very Smile, and all very unknown. And when you finally get to see the creature behind the curse, well, let's say you might notice a few similarities. Well, that's everything I had to say about, well, all these movies. Even though this video took bloody ages to make, as you can expect, I haven't watched like every single horror movie in the world. So if you've got any recommendations, then please put them in the comments and I might check them out. Patrons can see this video a day early, so if you're interested in hopping on the Patreon bandwagon, then please do check it out. You patrons make videos like this possible, really long ones that could easily get demonetized, so thank you very, very much for keeping lights on here. With the casting of Frank Stone coming out, and changes to Skull Merchant and Twins in the mid-chapter, I've got plenty to do in the future. So, I'll see you next time when I'll be talking about the casting of Frank Stone. See you then.